Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me. I'll go ahead and get started here in just a second. Before I start off, the last open session that I did, I was having a little bit of audio issues. Can everyone hear me all right? Hey, thank you very much. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Chad Carlson from Platform.sh, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about some experimentation that we've done for our company, replicating this decoupled Drupal pattern. In this case, pulling Drupal directly into a Gatsby app. And because of the way that Platform.sh works, we can keep the code base of these two apps together in a single repository and deploy it to a single project. And so at the end of the day, we're going to have two apps, one repo, and then multiple containers communicating with each other in this cluster that we can spin up. So I wanted to show you how that kind of works. So here's an old picture of me. I work for the DevRel team at Platform.sh. Over the last few months, I've been working with a couple different variations of this, pulling in different types of data into Gatsby, this headless CMS pattern, as it's called in some circles. So that's been Drupal, it's been WordPress, it's been another piece of software called Strappy, which is really interesting. All of these have the same basic principles to them, as I'm going to cover in this talk, that you set up a configuration that provides the URL that it expects this CMS to be located at. And as a part of your Gatsby build, content in the structure that it expects is queried with GraphQL and used to build that front end site. And you can actually have multiple backend CMSs. I know I've seen examples of somebody actually having two and a WordPress backend and maybe one additional one to, I guess, diversify your content sources and have different teams working on specific kinds of content. But in general, I think that's the big argument for doing it in this way, is to have your front-end development team not exactly concerned with what the content team is doing. If you're developing something like this from a client, that might be something that they want. And this is one way to do it. Further, what I'm going to go into is an interesting thing with Drupal on platform, which is that we're able to set up live previews on our development environments. So on our production environment, everything is a full Gatsby build, but we can actually run a development server on a non-production environment and get instant preview of content changes on this Drupal backend. So that's what I'll show at the end of this talk. All right, enough of that part. So let's talk about actually doing this, pulling Drupal content into Gatsby. So we're going to start off with talking about Gatsby. Initially, I know that there was another session that was talking about that as well, but we'll go through it quickly in case you're not familiar with what the innards of Gatsby look like. And then we'll look at how this configuration to pull Drupal into Gatsby's data layer during the build with a system, with a set of plugins that they call source plugins, what that looks like and how you can configure it for a backend Drupal app on platform at least, but it should be general enough to pull it from anywhere. Then we will go a little bit platform specific and take a look at how this multi-app configuration, what it looks like and how you do it. And then take the next step of actually connecting those two containers together and getting the pattern that we want before finally moving on to this live preview feature for our development environments. So first off, Gatsby. Gatsby is, if you don't already know, it's a static site generator for Node.js, but it's, you know, if you talk to Gatsby people, they'll say that it's not just a static site generator, especially for this feature of of source plugins, that it's powerful enough to do a whole lot more and pull in all kinds of different services during its build. It's built up from React, and it's got really smart importing for your style sheets and JavaScript, so that you're really minimizing the load client side as much as completely possible. For those individual pages, you only load what you actually need there. And all of this is for the purpose for making as fast a site as possible for the client. If we could take a look at the folder structure here very quickly, this would be basic. If you ran a Gatsby new command, you're going to get something that looks a lot like this. It's been modified slightly to fit the purposes of this exact demo. But you have a plugins and a final build public subdirectory. And in your source subdirectory, we're going to have our template JavaScript files. So if you've worked with React, you're probably familiar with what this looks like. We have one for our homepage, and then templates for individual articles and the list of articles. So those will be the views that we finally get that are going to be listing our whole catalog of articles on Drupal, and then the individual pages that'll come one-to-one from those. For configuring the Gatsby site, we have these two main files here at the bottom. The config.js file is going to give your main configuration about metadata about your site, but this is where we're really defining where's this backend Drupal site. And there are a couple other options that you can include in there of authentication and things like that for that backend. And then the second one is this Node.js file, which all this is going to do is you're going to leverage a create page function to identify a single or your entire catalog of Drupal articles and create individual pages for them using this article.js template. But the actual generation of the individual pages happens in this Node.js file. So if we go into that config.js file, what we're going to want to do is tell Gatsby that we want to pull content in from Drupal. And whether it was Drupal or WordPress, all of these are consumable by Gatsby from the source plugins. And they'll have this structure, their name of Gatsby-source- whatever it may be. So we're going to be using Gatsby source Drupal. Obviously, I think I said already, it's not confined to backend CMSs. You can attach a service like Stripe or many other. I think on this next graphic here that I pulled off the Gatsby documentation, you can pull in a search service, as many different services as you want. But the whole goal here is that during Gatsby's builds, you're going to make as big of a GraphQL query as there is content or service information during its build, with the whole goal that you're going to compile this, you're going to generate all of this built HTML at the very end. And its philosophy then is the trade-off of, I would rather extend my build a little bit longer to get every single Drupal article or every WordPress article, rather than trying to request that data when the client actually visits that page, which has its advantages. I want a fast site for my client when they visit. And what happens if my backend site goes down? If it goes down, doesn't really matter, because I've already generated that static HTML during my build phase. So thinking about where we want to go, typically when I have seen tutorials about trying to actually accomplish this pattern, whatever the backend may be, it will typically be a version of, you have Gatsby hosted here and you have Drupal hosted here. And so you need to do at least that level of hard coding to get the backend URL for that Drupal backend. And when we get to live preview, Drupal needs the same information to be able to ping that Gatsby front end and give you that preview of any updated content that happens on your backend. So with Platform.sh, we can leverage the fact that with a few pieces of configuration, a few configuration files, we can deploy from a single repository multiple app containers to have them all in the same cluster, defined in the same repo, and then just get them to communicate with one another. So on Platform, our configuration is at minimum these three: a roots file to say how you want requests to be handled, services YAML to say obviously your services, which in the case of our Drupal app, we're going to have a database and we're going to have Redis, and then one or more app YAML files. And you use that to define your runtime and how you want it to be built and deployed. So communicating with one another, we have here an example config file for our Drupal site. I have my runtime defined for PHP, my relationships, which in this case, I get a MySQL container and a Redis container, and it's accessible to Drupal through this database and Redis relationship here. I'm going to just run a composer-based build of my Drupal site and set up Drush. And this is the extent of the normal configuration for Drupal. For Gatsby, we can take that same idea here, and use node 12. And we could define a relationship in Gatsby that communicates with this other container, with our Drupal container that we just defined. So in the same way that the database is accessible to Drupal through the database relationship, now anything we want to pull from this backend Drupal site is accessible here through this relationship. A minor note here, just as something to recognize, this is a configuration file that's actually committed to your repository. So if at any time in your Gatsby app you want to try node 14, and I know 15 is coming out soon as well, and same with Drupal. If you wanted to update, you have a separate file, like I said, for a version of MySQL. So you could up the version on a new branch, commit that file on that branch, and test out your whole application just by changing that character. And you get an updated version to test out your application on. So in this file, we can define the sort of the difference between building our app and actually deploying our application. And when the changeover happens during the deploy phase, our file system is read-only. We want that. It's a good idea for security reasons. And you have write access during the build stage. But both of our app containers are going to go through these stages simultaneously. So if I want to get data from our Drupal backend, I have to wait until it's built. So I can't pull data from Drupal in my Gatsby app until after this deploy phase is finished. And so you'll see that's why I've actually delayed. I'll show you the script in a second here, but all of the pulling through this relationship happens at this delayed post-deploy step. So we don't have write access at that point, but the Drupal container is finally available to the Gatsby app. And anything that we need write access to, like for Gatsby, we need to make sure that this public subdirectory, we can write to it. So we're going to have to define some mounts to get around that. But this will allow us to pull that data. So let's actually connect the two together by looking at this config.js file. So by default, we're going to pull content from this JSON API endpoint. And we're going to need to define this base URL. So like I said, if you had these two sites hosted in totally separate places, this is a value you would normally hard code and commit just like that. But because they're in the same project on Platform, and because they can exist on multiple environments, every branch or pull request on Platform that you're trying to spin up to either create new content or modify the front end, you can have this relationship between the two apps. We can use environment variables to define what this backend root is. So you'll see I'm actually using this backend root variable here as my base URL. So in this case, I'm pulling credentials from that Drupal relationship I defined in the app YAML file. And from that location, I'm going to use that to define the base URL. And so this source plugin, which is right here, Gatsby source Drupal, is going to know to look at that JSON API endpoint and pull data from that during when we finally run Gatsby build. But it'll be contained within the project and specific to whatever branch we're on, because this environment variable is going to be isolated in each environment, but it's going to be the same relationship. But yeah, it'll be a totally new copy of this Drupal app on the new environment, but we will still get that connection. As you might expect, as we go back into our Drupal configuration, we've deployed it, we're not exactly going to want an article on our front end site to have this default node hash path. We're going to want something that's a little bit cleaner. We could obviously do something fancy on the front end, but what I've done here is just installed and enabled path auto and then set up a new pattern for each of my articles to just go to articles and then some slug of that title. And then that'll be replicated. I think we'll go back to the Node.js file in a second here, but then that'll be replicated in our front end. Yeah, I did come back to here. So yeah, I'm going to make a GraphQL query to get all of my articles from Drupal using that URL that we're pulling from the environment variable, pulling from that relationship. And from there, I'm going to get my title, the ID for the article, my body, when it was created, and I'm going to get that alias along with whatever image is specific to that article. And then I'm going to use that alias to define the path for each new page that I create using that template I talked about earlier. And I have a short video here. Maybe. We have our index.js file that just got deployed into this final HTML for our front page. And then I have two articles on my Drupal backend that are now on my Gatsby front end, pulled in during its build. Not much of a video, but I'll show you the live site in a second here. Whoop, wrong page. So on its own, that's nice. We got pretty much as far as we wanted to go. We have a front-end Gatsby app. During our builds, we're pulling in that Drupal content. Fantastic. And we can, both teams can contribute to the same repository and the same project, and doesn't matter which app that they're contributing to. It'll be together and deployed to the same project. The thing that we were able to enable because of the way that we can do it on platform is this live preview feature. So I think I mentioned already, I can have, the goal here is going to be keep exactly what we have now on our production environment, but during the editor and content creator cycle that we have for our backend content, we very well might want to have a dedicated staging environment that somebody can contribute a new article to and deploy it on the isolated environment, and they hand it off to their boss for review or their team for review, and they give some feedback for that backend content. And they can very easily, with this live preview feature, make those individual edits, or the person who's reviewing can, and it'll result in a instant copy on that Gatsby front end. And so that'll really narrow down that review cycle for those changes to that content. And we can do that in the same project. And it'll tell you in the source plugin for Gatsby exactly how to enable that. But we first need to do some things to our Drupal backend, because it's going to be placing requests on that front end Drupal site or that front end Gatsby site in order to be able to do that. So we're going to install and enable the Gatsby Live Preview module in our Drupal app. And when we configure it, we're going to point our preview server to that front end app. And then we're going to place a definition for a callback hook here to an endpoint that's been created on Gatsby __ refresh that will actually enable that regeneration of all the content. It'll repull, redo the GraphQL query on our Drupal site and rebuild that front end. The only other configuration that we need to do is on the Gatsby side. We set one environment variable that says, yes, I want that endpoint to exist. And then if we go back to our app.yaml file in our post deploy script, we're going to, like I said, have this division. I can read from the environment and say, I'm a master, I'm on a production site. I just want the full build. I don't want any of this live preview business. I can open a new branch if I want to update the backend. But in our start command, I can instead say, just serve that static content if it's master. Otherwise, run that development server on any other branch, on any other environment. So we enable all of these in Drupal, and we set the configuration in that Gatsby live preview inside of our Drupal site to point at this refresh endpoint. And then here, I think I'm actually going to just show you the live site. So this is what the project will look like on Platform. We have our production environment that has a full build, but I've created this test environment here, which here is what my front end looks like. And I have my Drupal articles here. And then I can go to my backend Drupal site. So I got my Drupal 8 backend. And so what I'm going to do is just edit this summary for the second article. And I'm going to save that. And then there we go. That'll update that front end Gatsby site. And what it's doing is, as soon as I save this article, it's going to use that plugin to then hit this endpoint right here. And as a result, we get this update to our front end article. I do not want to delete that article. I think I could do it with the title as well. And there we go. And that should also update the slug that we have here. Image isn't loading for some reason. But yeah, so we have those two parts. We have this built out production site on our master environment, but then anytime that we want to branch this environment, we'll have this live preview feature available to us and available to whoever's working on that content on the back end. And I think I may have finished a little early. Yeah, so thank you all for coming and letting me talk to you about this. It's a cool little project, but certainly something that you can try and replicate for your client or just to play around with yourself. If you are interested in checking out how we get this to work in a little bit more detail, you can go to our organization where we keep all of our template apps at Platform.sh-templates on GitHub. And this one will be under Gatsby-Drupal. And if you go to that repository, you can actually click this button and it will spin up one of these projects for you right off the bat. Where are my slides? But if any other Drupal that you're interested in checking out how we handle it on platform, we have 8, 9 multi-site configuration for Drupal 8 and a few other distributions like Apinio and GovCMS 8. So thank you very, very much for having me, and happy to take any questions if any of you have them. Hey, thanks, Mauricio. I appreciate that. Here. Any questions at all, guys? I'm happy to hang out for the end of the session. Or anything I went too fast with the previous slide.